Imagine this, you're sitting alone in your living room late at night. The house is quiet, save for the faint hum of your refrigerator. Your phone vibrates. You glance at the screen. No caller ID. Against your better judgment, you pick it up. "Hello," you say. There's silence on the other end. Then a faint whisper, "I'm watching you." For a moment your heart races, but you laugh it off. It must be a prank call. But as you hang up, the hairs on your neck stand on end. What if it wasn't? Tonight we'll explore 5 creepiest phone calls that will keep you up at night. These aren't urban legends or Hollywood scripts. These are real accounts from people just like you. Each story is more unsettling than the last, and by the end you might find yourself unplugging your phone for good. The first call comes from a young woman, Erica, who had taken a last-minute babysitting gig in a quiet suburban neighborhood. It was an easy job, 3 kids already tucked in bed, and parents who promised to be back by midnight. Around 9:30 p.m., Erica received a call on the house's landline. A man's voice, low and deliberate, asked, "Have you checked the children?" Confused, Erica brushed it off as a wrong number. But then the phone rang again. Same voice, same question. Her stomach dropped. She decided to check on the kids. All 3 were sound asleep. When she returned to the living room, the phone rang again. This time the voice added, "You didn't look close enough." Erica froze. She called the police, who traced the call. It was coming from inside the house. When officers arrived, they found muddy footprints leading upstairs and a knife left on the children's dresser. Erica's heart pounded as the officers carefully searched the house. She clung to the youngest officer, unable to shake the feeling that someone was still there, watching her. The living room lights flickered. A shadow moved across the hallway. "Stay here," one of the officers whispered, motioning for Erica to remain seated. He and his partner drew their weapons and headed toward the staircase. Minutes felt like hours. Erica strained her ears, listening for any sound. Then a muffled thud echoed from upstairs. "Clear," one officer shouted. The tension in the room eased momentarily. The second officer returned holding a small device. It was a burner phone. He must have been using this to make the calls. "Looks like he's gone now." Erica's relief was short-lived. "What about the footprints?" she asked. The officer hesitated. They stopped at the window in the children's room. It was left open, but no sign of forced entry. Erica's stomach churned. She was certain she had locked every window when she arrived. The parents returned home shortly after the police finished their search. They apologized profusely for the ordeal and insisted on walking Erica to her car. By the time she got home, it was past midnight. Erica locked her door and double-checked every window before collapsing on the couch. That's when her phone buzzed. She didn't recognize the number, but the area code matched the one from the landline at the house. "Don't answer it," she whispered to herself, but curiosity got the better of her. "Hello?" There was breathing on the other end. Then the same voice, "You shouldn't have left." Erica dropped the phone, trembling. She immediately called the police again, but by the time they arrived, the number was untraceable. For weeks, Erica lived in fear. Every creak, every shadow felt like a threat. But the calls stopped, and life slowly returned to normal. She convinced herself it had been a sick prank, a stranger who had fled when the police arrived. But then, 6 months later, a news report caught her attention. A man had been arrested for a string of home invasions in the area. His MO, stalking babysitters. The picture of the suspect made Erica's blood run cold. She recognized the face. It was one of the neighbors who had waved to her when she first arrived at the house that night. But the most chilling part? When police searched his home, they found a notebook with detailed entries about his victims. On one of the pages, her name was scrawled, along with a simple phrase, "Next time she won't get away." After seeing the news, Erica's old fears crept back in. She couldn't shake the thought of her name written in that notebook. She convinced herself it was over. The man was behind bars, and she was safe. But deep down, she couldn't ignore the gnawing unease. Then the call returned. It started one quiet evening, while Erica was studying for a college exam. Her phone buzzed, unknown number. She froze, her pulse quickening. Taking a deep breath, she let it ring out, but when her voicemail notification chimed, she reluctantly played the message. At first it was static, but then came a faint voice, distorted and distant. "You should have checked again." Erica dropped her phone. She felt like she was back in that house, the voice seeping into her mind. But this time, she wasn't just scared. She was angry. She contacted the police again, hoping they could trace the number. But when they checked, they found nothing. The call was routed through a series of untraceable numbers. The officer she spoke to tried to reassure her, but his face betrayed a hint of concern. "Let us know if it happens again," he said. The next night, Erica locked every door and window in her apartment and tried to sleep. But at 2:37 a.m., a loud banging on her front door jolted her awake. Her heart raced as she grabbed her phone and crept toward the door. "Who is it?" she called out, trying to steady her trembling voice. The banging stopped, replaced by a faint scratching sound, as if someone was dragging their nails across the wood. Erica backed away, clutching her phone. She called 911, whispering to the operator about the intruder. As she waited for the police, the scratching continued. Then, suddenly her phone lit up with a new call. Against every instinct, she answered. "You left the window open," the voice said. Erica's blood turned to ice. She turned toward the window in her bedroom. It was closed. She was sure of it. But then she saw it. The latch was unlocked. She didn't have time to process the thought. The sound of breaking glass from the other room sent her running toward the bathroom, where she locked herself inside. She could hear heavy footsteps in the apartment now, moving deliberately, as if whoever was there wanted her to know they weren't in a hurry. The footsteps stopped just outside the bathroom door. "Found you," the voice said, this time clearer, closer. Erica braced herself, clutching the only weapon she had, a ceramic toothbrush holder. But then, red and blue lights flooded through the small bathroom window, and she heard a loud bang as police broke down her door. When the officers entered, they found no one in the apartment. The front door was still locked, the windows untouched. The only sign of intrusion was a single muddy footprint in the middle of the living room. The police searched the area, but found nothing. They told Erica it was likely a prank, someone playing on her fears after hearing about the previous incident. But Erica knew better. A week later, Erica decided to leave town. She packed her bags and moved in with her sister across the state. For the first time in months, she felt safe. But on her first night in her sister's home, her phone buzzed again. This time, the message was different. A voice, calm and measured, said, "You can't run forever." The call ended, and when Erica looked down at her phone, her blood froze. The caller ID wasn't an unknown number this time. It was her own. Our next call comes from James, a nurse who worked the night shift at an old hospital. Around 3:15 a.m., he received a call from a patient's room. When he picked up, a woman's voice whispered, "Help me." James rushed to the room, but it was empty. The patient who had been staying there had passed away earlier that evening. Thinking it was a prank, James checked the phone log. The call had indeed come from the room, but the line had been disconnected hours ago. James stared at the phone log, his mind racing. The timestamp didn't lie. The call had come from room 407. But how? He tried to shake it off as a glitch in the system, yet something gnawed at him. The air in the hallway outside room 407 felt colder than the rest of the hospital. The fluorescent lights flickered as James stepped inside. The bed was neatly made, the monitors turned off. Everything appeared normal, but the room felt wrong, heavy like the air was pressing down on him. Just as he was about to leave, he heard it again. "Help me." The voice was faint but unmistakable, coming from behind him. He spun around, heart pounding, but the room was empty. The next morning, James couldn't shake the events of the night. He confided in an older nurse, Linda, who had worked at the hospital for decades. When he mentioned room 407, her face went pale. "You don't know about that room?" she asked. Her voice barely above a whisper. Linda explained that room 407 had a dark history. Years ago, a young woman named Margaret had been admitted for a routine procedure. Something went wrong during surgery, and she died unexpectedly. Her family accused the hospital of negligence, claiming the staff had ignored her cries for help. She was trying to call for assistance when she passed. Linda said. Her call button was in her hand when they found her. James felt a chill run down his spine. Since then, Linda continued, strange things have happened in that room. Staff have heard voices, phones ring when the lines disconnected, and some patients claim they see a woman standing in the corner at night. James tried to brush it off as superstition, but deep down he wasn't so sure. A few nights later, James was back on the night shift. He deliberately avoided room 407, but as 3:15 a.m. approached, his anxiety grew. Then his phone rang. This time the call came from room 412, 2 doors down from room 407. James answered hesitantly. "Help me," the voice whispered again. James rushed to room 412, but it was empty. The patient who had been staying there had been discharged earlier that evening. As he stood in the doorway, he heard a faint tapping sound. Turning slowly, he saw that the door to room 407 was ajar. He hadn't touched it. He stepped closer, peering inside. For a moment, everything was quiet. Then from the corner of the room, he heard the sound of labored breathing, followed by the faint click of a call button. James bolted, his heart racing. Determined to get answers, James began digging into hospital records. He discovered that the investigation into Margaret's death had been quietly closed, with no clear resolution. Witness testimonies had vanished, and the hospital had settled with the family under the condition of silence. It was as if Margaret's story had been erased. That night, James made a decision. He returned to room 407, determined to confront whatever was haunting the space. He brought with him an old call button he'd found in storage, similar to the one Margaret would have used. Placing the call button on the nightstand, he said aloud, "I'm listening, tell me what you need." For a moment nothing happened, then the room grew icy cold. The call button lit up, even though it wasn't connected to anything. James heard the voice again, clearer this time. They didn't listen. The words sent a shiver down his spine. James reported everything to the hospital administration, but they dismissed his claims. Frustrated, he reached out to Margaret's family, hoping to give them some closure. They were grateful, but they too seemed resigned to the mystery. On his next shift, James was walking past room 407 when he noticed something strange. The room's door, which was usually left open, was now sealed shut with a sign that read "Under Maintenance." Confused, James asked Linda about it. She looked at him with wide eyes. "James, room 407 was demolished yesterday." James froze. He had walked past the room just hours before and seen it intact. When he turned back to where the room, James stood frozen, staring at the blank wall where room 407 had been. His mind raced. He had seen the room just hours ago, door open, lights flickering. How could it simply disappear? "Linda," James stammered. "I swear I just saw it. I walked by and the door was open. I heard the phone. I heard her." Linda's expression turned grim. She grabbed James by the arm and pulled him aside. "Listen to me," she said. "This hospital has secrets, secrets they don't want anyone to know. You need to stop asking questions for your own safety." But James couldn't let it go. That night, James returned to the floor where room 407 once stood. The hallway was eerily quiet, the air unnaturally cold. Even though the room was gone, he felt its presence. At exactly 3:15 a.m., James's phone rang. This time the caller ID displayed something impossible. Room 407. With trembling hands he answered. "Hello?" A woman's voice, clear and sorrowful, replied. "They'll never know the truth." The line went dead. James stood there, heart pounding, when he noticed something out of the corner of his eye. A shadow moved at the far end of the hallway. It was faint, but he could make out the outline of a woman in a hospital gown. She wasn't walking, she was gliding, her feet not touching the ground. James called out, "Margaret?" The figure stopped, turned its head slightly, and whispered, "Don't forget me." Then, just as quickly as she appeared, she was gone. James became obsessed with finding out what happened to Margaret. He scoured old records, combed through files, and interviewed retired staff members. Finally, he uncovered a hidden document buried deep in the archives, a report from a nurse who had been on duty the night Margaret died. The report detailed how Margaret had repeatedly pressed her call button, complaining of severe pain. But her cries were ignored, dismissed as post-surgical discomfort. When someone finally checked on her hours later, it was too late. The nurse's final note read, "She begged for help. I'll never forget her voice. We failed her." James knew what he had to do. On his next night off, James visited Margaret's grave. He brought with him a small bouquet of white lilies and the call button he'd taken from the hospital. Kneeling by her headstone, he said, "I'm so sorry for what happened to you. You deserved better. I promise I'll make sure your story isn't forgotten." As he placed the call button on her grave, the air around him grew still. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of peace, as if the weight pressing down on him had lifted. When James returned to the hospital, the strange occurrences stopped. The phones no longer rang with ghostly whispers, and the shadowy figure was never seen again. But James couldn't forget. He wrote an anonymous letter detailing everything he had discovered about Margaret's death and sent it to a local journalist. Weeks later, the story made headlines, exposing the negligence that had led to her tragic end. James eventually left the hospital, but the experience stayed with him. He often wondered if Margaret had finally found peace, or if she was still out there, watching, waiting for someone else to listen. And to this day, every time James's phone rings late at night, he hesitates before answering, half expecting to hear her voice whisper, "Help me." Lila, a rideshare driver, was on her way to pick up a passenger late one night. She received a call from the app's number system. A woman's voice said, "Don't come. It's not safe." Confused, Lila ignored the warning and headed to the location. When she arrived, the house was dark and abandoned. Feeling uneasy, she decided to leave. The next day, Lila learned that a rideshare driver had been found dead at that very address just hours after her scheduled pickup. To this day, she wonders who called her and why they saved her life. Lila couldn't stop thinking about the call. The woman's voice, calm but urgent, echoed in her mind. "Don't come, it's not safe." Who had called her, and how did they know something terrible was going to happen? Shaken, Lila decided to take a break from driving for a few days. But her curiosity got the better of her. She started searching online for any news about the driver who had been killed. The story was chilling. The driver, a man named Greg, had been lured to the same address through the rideshare app. When he arrived, he was attacked in his car. The police described the scene as a robbery gone wrong, but the details didn't add up. Why would someone use a rideshare to lure a victim, only to leave no witnesses? As the days passed, Lila began to notice strange things. Her phone would occasionally buzz with missed calls from numbers she didn't recognize. When she tried calling them back, the numbers were out of service. One evening, she was scrolling through her rideshare history when she noticed something odd. The name and profile picture of the passenger she had been scheduled to pick up at the abandoned house were gone. Instead, the trip log simply read, "Unknown passenger." Lila contacted the rideshare company, hoping for answers. But when she asked about the call warning her not to go, they insisted no such call had been made through their system. "That's impossible," Lila said. "I answered the call through the app." The representative hesitated. "Our records don't show any incoming calls to your account that night." Lila hung up, her unease growing. A week later, Lila decided to return to work. She stuck to well-lit, busy areas, avoiding late-night pickups. But one night, as she was about to finish her shift, her phone buzzed with another ride request. The location made her stomach drop, the same abandoned house. Before she could cancel, her phone rang. The number was once again from the app system. Hands trembling, she answered. "You didn't listen the first time," the same woman's voice said, colder this time. "Don't go back." The call ended abruptly. Lila stared at her screen, heart pounding. This time, she didn't ignore the warning. She canceled the ride and drove straight home. That night, as Lila lay in bed, her phone buzzed again. It was a notification from the rideshare app, but when she opened it, there was no new ride request. Instead, her screen glitched, and for a brief moment, a message appeared. "You're still being watched." Panicking, Lila shut off her phone and looked around her room. Everything was quiet, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was nearby. The next morning, she inspected her car. On the back seat window, she found a faint handprint, too large to belong to any passenger she'd recently driven. Determined to find out what was happening, Lila visited the abandoned house in broad daylight. The property was overgrown with weeds, its windows boarded up, but as she approached, she noticed a faint scratching noise coming from inside. Peering through a crack in the boards, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The interior of the house was empty, except for a single old rotary phone sitting on the floor. As she stepped back, her phone buzzed in her pocket. When she looked, it was another call from the rideshare system. She answered, her voice shaking. "Who is this? What do you want from me?" There was silence on the other end. Then faintly she heard the woman's voice again. "They're watching you." Before Lila could respond, the call ended, and her phone screen went black. Lila took her story to the police, but they dismissed it as a series of pranks or glitches. Frustrated, she began her own investigation. She learned that the abandoned house had been the site of several violent crimes over the years, including the murder of a young woman who had once lived there. Locals believed the house was cursed, with rumors of ghostly activity and strange lights seen at night. Some even claimed to hear a woman's voice calling for help near the property. Lila decided to stop driving for the rideshare service altogether, but on what would have been her last night on the job, her phone rang one final time. This time the voice was different. It was male, deep and menacing. "She can't protect you forever," it said. The call ended, and Lila felt an overwhelming sense of dread. She moved out of town shortly after, leaving her car and the rideshare app behind. But every so often, when she's alone at night, her phone buzzes with an unknown number. And no matter how much time has passed, she still wonders, was the woman's voice a warning from beyond the grave, or something even darker? Would you have answered the call? Months passed, and Lila tried to put the strange events behind her. She moved to a new town, changed her number, and even got rid of the car she had used for ride sharing. For a while it seemed to work. Life grew quiet again, but one night, as she was unpacking boxes in her new apartment, her phone buzzed. She froze. The number was unknown. She stared at the screen, debating whether to answer. Against her better judgment, she picked it up. "Hello?" There was no voice this time, just the sound of faint breathing, slow and deliberate. Then came a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming on a hard surface. "Who is this?" she demanded, her voice breaking. The line went silent for a moment before a familiar male voice spoke. "You can't run from us." The call ended, leaving Lila trembling. From that night forward, strange things began happening in her new apartment. She would wake up to find her front door unlocked, even though she had double-checked it before bed. Her phone alarm would go off at exactly 3 a.m., even though she hadn't set it. One night, while brushing her teeth, she caught a glimpse of something in the bathroom mirror, a shadowy figure standing behind her. When she turned around, the room was empty. She became paranoid, convinced she was being watched. The feeling grew stronger whenever she was near her car, which she had sold to a stranger weeks ago. She couldn't shake the sense that somehow, the car or whatever was tied to it, wasn't finished with her. Desperate for answers, Lila decided to contact a psychic who specialized in paranormal investigations. The psychic, an older woman named Mira, listened carefully as Lila recounted everything. The phone calls, the abandoned house, the rideshare passenger who never showed up. After a long silence, Mira finally spoke. "The woman's voice you heard was a warning." "Yes, but it wasn't just about that house. Something far older and darker was using the house as a gateway. And when you went there, it noticed you." Lila's blood ran cold. "It marked you," Mira continued. "It's attached to you now, feeding off your fear. That's why it keeps calling. It's trying to wear you down. What can I do to stop it? Lila asked, her voice trembling. Mira shook her head. You can't stop it, but you might be able to break its hold. You need to confront it, face it head on and make it release you. With no other options, Lila decided to return to the abandoned house. She brought with her a flashlight, a recorder and a single hope that confronting whatever was haunting her would end this nightmare. The house was even more decrepit than she remembered. As she stepped inside, the air grew heavy, and the faint sound of a phone ringing echoed through the halls. She followed the sound to the living room. The rotary phone she had seen through the boarded-up window was there, sitting on a dusty table. It began to ring as soon as she entered the room. Lila hesitated, her hand hovering over the receiver. Finally, she picked it up. "Why are you doing this to me?" she asked, her voice shaking. There was no immediate response. Then the woman's voice spoke again, softer this time. "I warned you not to come." Before Lila could respond, the voice shifted. It was no longer the woman. The deep, menacing male voice from her last call spoke. "She can't save you now." The lights in the house flickered violently, and the temperature plummeted. Lila felt a presence behind her, but when she turned, the room was empty. "I'm not afraid of you," she screamed, clutching the receiver. "Leave me alone." The line crackled, and for a moment she thought she heard laughter. Then everything went silent. The air grew still, and the oppressive feeling that had been following her lifted. When Lila left the house, the sun was rising. She felt lighter, as if a weight had been taken off her shoulders. The strange occurrences stopped after that. No more calls, no more shadows, no more alarms at 3 a.m. But Lila couldn't forget the voice, or the feeling that something ancient and malevolent had taken an interest in her. She never returned to ride-sharing, and she never answered unknown numbers again. But every once in a while, late at night, her phone would buzz with a notification from the rideshare app. No matter how much time had passed, the message was always the same: pickup request from unknown passenger. In a small town, an old payphone sat at the corner of an empty street. Locals claimed it would ring, even though it hadn't been connected for years. One night, a man named Robert answered it on a dare. A child's voice said, "Daddy, where are you?" Robert, who had lost his daughter in a car accident years ago, dropped the phone and ran. But when he turned back, the phone was swinging on its cord, as though someone invisible had just hung up. Robert couldn't sleep that night. The child's voice on the payphone was seared into his mind, so eerily familiar, so heartbreakingly real. It wasn't possible, he told himself. His daughter, Angelina, was gone. She had been for years. But the voice had said, "Daddy, where are you?" in the same soft tone Angelina used to use when she was scared. The next morning, Robert tried to push the incident aside. He convinced himself it had to be a prank or his imagination running wild. But as the day wore on, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he needed to go back to that payphone. That evening, Robert returned to the corner where the old payphone stood. It looked as ordinary as ever, rusted, with cracked glass and faded numbers on the buttons. But as he approached, he noticed something odd. The receiver, which he distinctly remembered leaving on the hook, was now dangling from its cord. Robert hesitated. His heart pounded in his chest as he picked up the receiver. Static crackled on the line, followed by a faint voice. "Daddy," he froze. It was Angelina's voice again, clear and unmistakable. "Angelina," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Is that you? Why did you leave me, Daddy?" the voice asked. The words laced with sorrow. Tears streamed down Robert's face. "I didn't leave you, sweetheart. It was an accident. I'm so sorry. I would give anything to have you back." The line went silent for a moment. Then the voice whispered, "You can come find me." Before Robert could respond, the line went dead. Haunted by the conversation, Robert decided to investigate the payphone. He visited the local library, digging through old records and archives. He discovered that the payphone had been installed decades ago but had been disconnected for years after the street corner became deserted. But what really caught his attention was a story buried in an old newspaper article. Years before Angelina's accident, a child named Lily had gone missing near that very corner. Witnesses reported hearing strange sounds coming from the payphone the night she disappeared. The case was never solved. Robert began to wonder, was the voice on the phone truly Angelina, or was it something else? Unable to resist the pull of the mystery, Robert returned to the payphone night after night, hoping to hear Angelina's voice again. Each time he was met with silence. But one stormy evening, as lightning illuminated the dark sky, the phone began to ring. Robert snatched the receiver. "Angelina, are you there?" This time the voice was different. It was deeper, colder, and filled with malice. "You shouldn't have come back," it said. Robert's breath hitched. "Who is this?" "You'll never find her," the voice taunted. "But she'll find you." The receiver grew hot in his hand, and he dropped it in shock. The phone swung wildly on its cord as a cold wind whipped through the empty street. Terrified, Robert sought out the town's oldest resident, a woman named Mrs. Halstead, who had lived there her entire life. When he mentioned the payphone, her expression darkened. "You fool," she said. "That phone doesn't bring people back. It takes them. Every so often, someone answers it, and they're never the same. Some vanish. Others lose their minds. Whatever you heard wasn't your daughter, it was something pretending to be her." Robert's stomach churned. "But I heard her voice. I know it was her." Mrs. Halstead shook her head. "That's how it gets to you. It knows your pain, your weakness. It uses them to lure you in." Determined to resist the pull of the payphone, Robert stayed away for weeks. But late one night, as he sat alone in his apartment, his phone rang. When he answered, he didn't hear the usual hum of the line. Instead, he heard static, and then Angelina's voice. "Daddy, I'm so cold. Please come get me," but it didn't respond. Instead, it stepped closer, emerging into the faint glow of a nearby street lamp. Robert's heart sank. It wasn't Angelina's. The figure resembled her in shape and size, but its features were wrong, distorted. Its eyes were too dark, its smile too wide, and its movements too unnatural, like a puppet on invisible strings. "Daddy," the figure said, its voice a chilling imitation of Angelina's. "You found me." Robert stumbled backward, his mind racing. "You're not her," he whispered, his voice cracking. "What are you?" The figure stopped, its head tilting unnaturally far to one side. "I'm what you wanted," it said, its voice shifting, now a mix of Angelina's tone and something deeper, hollow and cruel. The air grew icy, and Robert could feel an oppressive presence closing in around him. Behind him, the payphone began to ring again, louder and louder, the sound grating and unnatural. "Pick it up," the figure said, gesturing toward the phone. "She's waiting for you." Robert hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to run. But the thought of Angelina, of the possibility that some part of her might still exist, paralyzed him. "What happens if I do?" he asked, his voice trembling. The figure's smile widened. "You'll find her," it said simply. "You'll be together again. Isn't that what you want?" The phone's ringing grew deafening, and Robert's mind filled with memories of Angelina's laughter, her smile, the way she'd call him daddy when she needed comfort. Desperation overpowered reason. He reached for the receiver, his hand shaking. As soon as he touched it, the world around him changed. The street corner disappeared, replaced by a cold, endless void. Shadows stretched in every direction, flickering like dying flames. Robert felt weightless, yet unbearably heavy, as if he were sinking into an invisible abyss. "Angelina's," he called out, his voice echoing. From the darkness, a small figure emerged. It was Angelina. This time unmistakably her, with the same bright eyes and warm smile he remembered. She ran toward him, arms outstretched. "Daddy," she cried. Robert fell to his knees, pulling her into a tight embrace. Tears streamed down his face as he held her, overwhelmed by relief and love. "I missed you so much," he whispered. "I missed you too," she said, her voice soft. But then she pulled back slightly, her expression shifting to one of fear. "You shouldn't have come here, Daddy." Robert froze. "What do you mean?" "They won't let you leave," she whispered, glancing over his shoulder. Before he could turn, he felt a cold claw-like grip on his back. Robert screamed as he was dragged backward, Emily's voice fading into the distance. Shadows swirled around him, pulling him deeper into the void. He could hear whispers now, dozens of them, all overlapping and incomprehensible. One voice, however, stood out, a deep, guttural tone that echoed in his mind. "You asked for her," it said. "Now you belong to us." Robert fought against the pull, but it was useless. The last thing he saw was Angelina, her small figure growing distant, tears streaming down her face as she reached for him. Then everything went black. The next morning, the payphone was found swinging gently on its cord, as though someone had just hung it up. Robert's car was still parked nearby, but he was nowhere to be found. Over the following weeks, rumors spread through the town. Some claimed to see a man's shadow lingering near the payphone at night. Others said they heard it ringing, but no one dared to answer it anymore. Months later, a new story began to circulate. People who walked by the payphone late at night reported hearing a faint voice, pleading from the receiver. "Don't pick up," it would say. "Don't make the same mistake I did." But those who were brave or foolish enough to answer said they heard something else entirely. A child's voice, soft and innocent, asking, "Daddy, where are you?" Which of these calls has you most on edge? Leave a comment below and let us know which story gave you chills. Don't forget to hit the like button if you're still with us. It helps us keep bringing you these unsettling tales.